The morning they came to sell Thornfield Park, Cecily Marsh was already in the Great Hall before the buyers arrived, straightening the dust covers that should not have been there. She had pulled them off the pier glasses herself, folded each one with the care her mother had taught her, stacked them in the passage. Someone had replaced them in the night. She had asked Nell which of the buyers' men had been given access, and Nell had gone pale and said she did not know, and Cecily had smoothed her expression into something calm and attended to the covers again, because there was nothing else left to do with the morning except attend to things. The hall had been built for arriving in. Its ceiling was painted with scenes of harvest and river that required tilting the head back to appreciate, and the floor was pale stone inlaid with a compass rose. And in the years when Thornfield Park had been properly kept, the light came through the east-facing windows in a long gold sweep that made the whole room feel like something consecrated. This morning, the light came in at the wrong angle, or perhaps it was only the crowd of strangers filling it, and the harvest scenes above were lost in a haze of pipe smoke, and a man in a brown coat was pressing his thumbnail into the wood of the newel post to test the grain. Cecily crossed the floor to him and said, quietly, that he was welcome to note the quality of the timber in the printed particulars, which would be distributed at 9 o'clock. The man looked at her the way men looked at women who spoke without being spoken to, and then looked again, more carefully, taking in her plain dark wool and the slight callousing on her right hand from the ledger pen, and the fact that she held herself as though the floor were hers. He removed his thumb from the newel post. The man who had arranged the viewing, a manufacturer from somewhere north of Sheffield named Aldwych Price, had arrived with 2 agents and a quantity of opinions. He was 52 years old and had the assurance of someone who had not been refused in some time. He had walked the length of the hall before 8 o'clock, pointing at the plasterwork and estimating what modernization would require, and when Cecily had stepped forward to explain that the East Wing's plasterwork had been professionally assessed 2 years ago and the report was available for review, he had turned from her to his nearest agent and said, pleasantly, that he had not realized they were including the housekeeper's girl in the particulars. His agent had laughed. 3 or 4 other men in hearing distance had smiled. Cecily had stood with her ledger pressed against her ribs and said nothing, because there was nothing that could be said in that company that would cost less than everything. She had said instead that the report would be in the packet distributed at 9 o'clock, and excused herself to oversee the arrangement of the drawing-room chairs. If you pressed her, she would not have been able to explain why she was still in the house at all. The servants had been told their wages would be paid from the proceeds of the sale. The solicitor, a narrow man called Fenwick, had indicated this would happen before noon. There was a practical reason to remain. She told herself this was why she stayed, standing in the great hall at 8:30 in the morning with a ledger she had kept for 3 years, watching strangers test the floor with their heels and estimate the worth of things her mother had polished. The wages were part of it. That was true. She had also been told, from the age of 14, that the Earl of Ashford would return. Her mother, who had been housekeeper at Thornfield Park for 22 years, had said it with the certainty of someone stating a physical law. He would come back. The estate would require a patient hand until he did. Patience was a form of loyalty, and loyalty had a shape, and it looked like an account book kept current, a ledger of every shilling spent and justified, a brass fitting kept bright against the day there was someone to account to. Her mother had died 2 years ago, still waiting. The account book was the thing Cecily had kept, because she did not know what else there was to keep. She did not, at 8:30 on the morning of the sale, believe he was coming. She had stopped believing it on the day they set the date for the auction. What she had not been able to do was leave. There was a difference, she had found, between ceasing to believe in a thing and being able to set it down. The east windows threw their light across the stone floor. Cecily watched it move and held her ledger, and waited for 9 o'clock. She did not see the man standing in the garden. He had come up the long drive on foot, which was not how one arrived at Thornfield Park if one wished to be noticed. He had walked the last 4 miles from Ashwick Village with his coat collar turned against the October wind, and he had stopped at the garden gate, and he had stood there for some time before he opened it. Edward Cavanhill, Earl of Ashford, had not looked at his estate in 7 years. He looked at it now from the garden path, and the looking cost him something he had not budgeted for. The stone was the right gray. The windows had the right proportion. The kitchen garden to the east had been kept, and he could see the last of the autumn vegetables still standing in their rows, the beds bordered cleanly, the tool shed's door latched properly against the wind. Someone had kept this. Someone had done it with the care of a person who believed it mattered. He had come back expecting ruin. He had, on some level, wanted ruin, because ruin would have been appropriate. 7 years of absence should have consequences. The estate's quiet dignity in the October morning was harder to absorb than wreckage would have been. He moved along the garden path to the east-facing windows of the hall. He was not ready to go in. He understood with the clarity of a man who had had 7 years to learn his own worst habits, someone who required a moment of observation before he could cross a threshold he had reason to dread. He looked through the glass. In the great hall, surrounded by buyers and their agents, and a thin solicitor with a sheaf of papers, a young woman in a dark wool gown was directing a footman in the careful repositioning of a hall chair. She moved without agitation. She spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had given these instructions many times and expected them to be followed. And the footman followed them. Then she turned to a young maid pressed into the corner behind the staircase, who was, unmistakably, crying. And she went to her. He could not hear what she said. He watched her lay one hand briefly on the maid's arm and speak, and watched the maid draw a steadying breath and straighten, and watched the young woman in the dark wool gown move back into the hall without looking for gratitude. She stood for a moment, alone in a pocket of space that the buyers had not yet filled, and pressed her hand flat against the front of her ledger and tilted her head back to look up at the ceiling. He recognized the gesture. He had stood in that hall and tilted his head back at those harvest scenes himself, when he was young enough to find comfort in old painted things. He watched her lower her gaze and square her shoulders, and he stood in the cold October garden and felt something shift in his chest that he did not have a name for yet. He went in through the service entrance, which he still knew by heart. The first person he encountered in the back passage was a kitchen maid with red eyes and a coal smudge on her apron, who looked at him the way one looked at ghosts, which was, he supposed, not unreasonable. She pressed herself against the wall and said nothing. He told her quietly to fetch no one, and to say nothing to anyone until he indicated otherwise. He said it in the voice of a man who has learned, in 7 years of places that required it, how to be obeyed. She nodded. He moved through the passage toward the sound of voices. He came into the hall through the service door at the far end, and the buyer's nearest agent glanced at him and looked away, as one looked at tradesmen who used the wrong entrance. Price was at the far end of the room, examining the fireplace with the air of a man pricing its demolition. Fenwick stood at the hall table, sorting papers, and the young woman in the dark wool gown was 3 feet away, her back to him, looking at the door. He stood there for a moment, aware that he had not yet decided what he was going to do. The hall was the same. The compass rose on the floor was the same. The painted ceiling above was unchanged, except that someone had cleaned it, and he could see the difference at the edges where the smoke had been cleared and the colors were warmer. Someone had cleaned the ceiling on the slim chance he would come home and look up. The young woman turned. She had dark eyes, and she was startled by his presence in a way that she controlled before it fully registered on her face, and she was younger than he had estimated from the garden. 24, perhaps. She held a ledger. She looked at him with the expression of a person doing rapid calculations. He said, his voice rougher than it had been, that he was looking for the estate manager. She said there was no estate manager. She said the late steward's position had not been filled. She said it in the careful tone of a person deciding how much to volunteer to a stranger. He asked who had been managing the property. She said that would have been herself and the remaining household staff, as best they could. He looked at the ledger in her hands. He said, "For how long?" She said, with the particular flatness of someone who did not wish to be pitied, 3 years, my lord." She had called him my lord without knowing who he was. It was the form of address she was accustomed to using in this house. It cost her nothing, and it cost him considerably more than she could have known. He said, "I will need to speak with the solicitor before the auction proceeds." She looked at him. She was, he could see, an intelligent woman who was assembling available information at some speed. A stranger. The service entrance. 3 years. Something was changing behind her eyes, a thought arriving that she was not yet permitting herself to complete. He crossed the hall toward Fenwick before she could. He would have been more surprised had Thornfield Park not looked the way it looked, and he understood that surprise was a luxury for people who had not just spent 4 miles working up to a threshold. He presented himself to Fenwick by his full name and title. He watched the color drain from the solicitor's face by degrees, the way wax drains in heat, slowly, and then altogether. He said that the auction would not proceed, that he was alive, that he would require verification of this fact to be confirmed to the assembled parties, and that he was available to provide whatever documentation was necessary. Fenwick said, in a very small voice, "My lord." He said, "Quite." He had not anticipated how still the room would go at the sound of his name spoken aloud in the hall. He had thought himself forgotten. 7 years was sufficient time to become a rumor, a memory, a cautionary tale about men who abandoned their responsibilities. The buyers near enough to hear the exchange had gone rigid, the way people went rigid when a great piece of machinery reversed direction without warning. Price, at the far end of the room, had not yet heard. He would in a moment. Edward did not look back across the hall to where the young woman was standing. He should not have looked, but he did. She had not moved. She was standing exactly where he had left her, with her hand pressed flat against her ledger, and her expression was the most precisely contained expression he had seen in a long while, which was notable given that he had spent portions of the past 7 years in places that required the suppression of emotion as a survival practice. She was not displaying shock or elation or relief. She was holding everything inside herself with a deliberateness that spoke of a person who had decided, some time ago, that allowing herself to feel what she felt in public was not an available option. He looked away. There would be time. There was not immediately time, because in the next 3 minutes Fenwick summoned his junior, and Price walked the length of the room to discover what the disruption was, and the kitchen maid he had cautioned in the back passage had, predictably, told someone, and that someone had told someone, and the news moved through the house with the speed that domestic intelligence always moved, which was to say faster than any other form of transmission available in the Regency era. Lady Dorothea Cavanhill arrived from the morning room in a state that she was managing very capably into the shape of composure. She was 61 years old, and she had, Edward knew, arranged the sale of his estate from a position of genuine grief and genuine practicality and genuine self-interest in proportions he was not prepared to calculate this morning. She had believed him dead. He had, in fairness, done nothing for 7 years to contradict this belief. He could not be angry with her for believing it. He was not, he found, angry with her at all, which surprised him, because he had thought he would be. She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw in her face the same thing he had seen in the glass of the windows this morning. The recognition of something she had not expected to encounter, arriving with too much weight to immediately absorb. She said his name. Just his name. The given name. The way she had said it when he was 12 years old and had come home with a torn coat. It was perhaps the most unguarded thing he had ever heard her say in a public room. He said quietly, "I know." The assembled buyers watched this exchange with the stillness of men who understood that the transaction they had attended was no longer the transaction that was occurring. Price recovered first, as men of his temperament tended to recover, not gracefully, but loudly. He had a signed agreement. He had brought his agents 4 hours north. He had inspected the property and made his offer in good faith. And the offer had been accepted by the persons authorized to accept it, and he intended to know what this performance was about before he accepted any alteration to the morning's business. Lady Dorothea turned to him and said, in the tightly controlled voice of someone recalibrating under pressure, that there appeared to have been a significant development. Price said that he did not see why a development should obstruct a signed agreement, and he directed this to Fenwick. And Fenwick looked at the man who had just presented himself with documentation sufficient to establish identity and title, and then looked back at Price and appeared to reach the private conclusion that this was not a situation in which he intended to be the deciding voice. The next 2 hours were conducted in the library. Edward sat on one side of the library table with Fenwick and his junior and the documentation from his person, which included a letter from the consulate office at Lisbon, a sworn statement from a British magistrate in Porto, and 3 years of correspondence addressed to Thornfield Park that had been returned to sender. Lady Dorothea sat on the opposite side of the table and did not speak, except when Fenwick addressed her directly. Price attended the first half hour and then removed to the drawing room to conduct his own consultations in a voice audible through the door. Edward did not enjoy this portion of the day. He had not come back to conduct a legal proceeding in his own library. He had come back because the cost of not coming back had finally exceeded the cost of what he would have to face when he did, and because he had received a letter from Fenwick 3 months ago in Portugal that had contained the phrase "the household staff have been reduced to 3, and the remaining staff are owed wages from the last quarter," and something in him had moved, finally, in the direction of home. During the second hour, in a brief interval when Fenwick stepped out, Lady Dorothea said, "She has been in this house every day." He looked at her. "The girl," she said. "Miss Marsh. She wrote to me twice, asking me to delay. I did not delay." A pause. Her hands were folded on the table with the precision of a woman keeping them still. "I thought I was being practical," he said. "You believed me dead." "I believed it more easily than I should have," she said. "That is a different thing." He did not answer that. There was something in it that deserved more silence than the morning had so far provided. Harriet's portrait was upstairs in the East Gallery. He had known it would be there, had known it from the moment he walked through the service door and through the back passage and past the kitchen, where she had once stood on a cold November morning eating an apple, because she had been the kind of woman who ate apples in kitchens when she thought no one was looking. He had not gone upstairs. He would when the legal business was concluded, because that was what returning required. He had not been able to save her. He had not been there to try. Those were two different griefs that lived in the same place in him, and they were not the same grief. And it had taken him 4 years of moving between cities before he had understood the difference. The first grief was loss, which was real, and shared by every person who had loved Harriet, and could not be undone. The second grief was the knowledge of his own absence, which was not loss, but culpability. And it did not diminish with time the way loss did. It had followed him to Lisbon and to Oporto, and along the Languedoc coast, where he had worked as a translator for a shipping concern because work was the only thing that occupied enough of his mind to keep the rest of it quiet. He had not gone home because home was the place that contained everything he could not face. He had stayed away because staying away was possible, and facing it was not, and he had told himself that the estate could manage without him, because the estate had always managed. His steward was competent. His mother was capable. The staff were loyal. He had made arrangements. He had not known until Fenwick's letter arrived in Oporto 3 months ago that the steward had died, that his mother had quietly begun the process of sale, and that the staff had been reduced to 3 by attrition, with wages owed and no account to draw them from. He had not known that a young woman in a dark wool gown had been keeping account books for 3 years in the expectation that someone would eventually want to know. Those were worse foundations for continued absence than they were for a return. He had come back because absence had finally cost more than the alternative, and because someone had cleaned his painted ceiling on the chance that he might look up at it again, and because Fenwick's letter had said the wages were owed. There were worse foundations for a return. In the great hall, while the library proceedings continued, Miss Cecily Marsh had made herself as useful as it was possible to be in a room that had suspended all its original purposes. She had directed the kitchen maid, Nell, Edward would later learn, to bring tea to the agents waiting in the drawing room, not from any obligation to them, but because idle men in rooms with furniture were a greater liability than occupied ones. She had retrieved the printed particulars from Fenwick's table before someone made off with them. She had answered, twice, the question of whether the sale was proceeding, with the honest answer that she did not yet know. She had not permitted herself to consider what the morning meant. This was not from lack of intelligence. It was from the practiced discipline of a woman who had learned, over 3 years of managing other people's property on no authority, except the authority of knowing it better than anyone else, that hoping for a particular outcome before it was confirmed was a form of expenditure she could not afford. The ledger on her arm was not a prop. It was proof, if proof were needed, that she had not wasted any of the past 3 years on wishes. She had wasted some of the past 2 hours on Nell, who had been unable to suppress her feelings, and had communicated them to Cecily in the kitchen passage in a long whispered rush, and Cecily had held her friend's hands and said, with more steadiness than she felt, that nothing was confirmed yet, and that the household should continue as normal until it was. It was Lady Dorothea who ended the suspension. She came out of the library at midday, and she looked at Cecily Marsh standing in the great hall with her ledger, and she said, in the voice of a woman adjusting to a changed field, that Miss Marsh's presence in the house was no longer necessary. She said it with the courtesy of someone who does not consider themselves cruel, and she said it to Fenwick as though Cecily were not standing 4 feet away, and she said the words precisely as she always said words that were difficult, which was to say with a quality of finality that permitted no discussion. She said that the proceedings had taken an unexpected shape, and that the household staff would receive their wages, and that the solicitor would arrange for Miss Marsh to receive a suitable acknowledgment for her service in the interval. She said that Miss Marsh was, of course, the housekeeper's girl, and had done what she had been capable of doing, and that it would be remembered. Fenwick looked at Cecily, the way men looked at women in the middle of situations that were not of their engineering, and were definitely not their problem. Cecily stood very still. She thought of her mother. She thought of the account books stacked in the steward's office, 12 of them now, one for each quarter of the past 3 years, recording every nail purchased and every window reglazed and every hen bought to replace a stolen one, and every wage scraped together, and every debt deferred through personal arrangement with local tradesmen who had trusted her. She thought of the painted ceiling she had hired a man from Ashwick to clean, at her own expense because the estate account was exhausted, on the slim chance that someone might look up at it again. She thought of her mother's voice, certain as a physical law. He will come back. She thought of 3 years of not being able to set it down. She looked at Fenwick. She said very quietly that she would collect her things. It was Nell who came to her in the passage outside the drawing-room door, pressed close, breathing fast, and said that one of Price's agents had said, in the passage outside the library not 20 minutes ago, that it did not much matter who held title because the girl had no standing, and the signed papers were signed papers, and the housekeeper's girl could take her account books and her misplaced loyalty and return to wherever her kind went when the house changed hands. Cecily closed her eyes once. She opened them. She was aware of a particular sensation she had noticed 3 times in the past 3 years. Each time the situation had required more of her than she had budgeted for. It was not anger, exactly, though it had something of anger's temperature. It was the sensation of having held something carefully for a very long time and finding that the care had been sufficient and that she was not finished holding it. Her mother had called it backbone and said it was more useful than any other quality a woman could possess, and had been right. She said to Nell, in the calmest voice she possessed, "Go to the kitchen. Take nothing with you. Wait there." She went back to the great hall. She was not sure afterward why she had gone back instead of out. There was something in her that could not leave the house the way Price's man had described it. Quietly, as though the past 3 years of daily labor were a small embarrassment to be tidied away with her. She had not kept this house from love of her own position. She had kept it because it was worth keeping, because the painted ceiling was worth keeping, because the garden was worth keeping, because the compass rose in the floor had been laid by craftsmen who had understood that beauty in a threshold was not an extravagance, but a covenant. She had kept it because her mother had believed it was worth keeping, and because she had been, in the end, her mother's daughter. She stood in the hall with her ledger, and she looked at Price's 2 agents leaning against the far wall, with the ease of men who had already composed the scene in their minds, to their own advantage, and she looked at Fenwick at the table with his papers, and she did not see Edward Cavanhill until he was already crossing the floor. He did not come quickly. He came with the particular measured pace of a man who has decided something and is allowing it to be seen. He was still in his travel-worn coat, and his dark hair was still disordered from the walk. And there was nothing of ceremony about him except the way he moved, which was, she understood suddenly, from her whole body before her mind confirmed it, with the absolute authority of someone who does not require anyone's permission to be in this room. He stopped in the middle of the compass rose. The room had gone quiet around him, without anyone quite deciding to make it so. Price, near the fireplace, turned. Lady Dorothea, at the library door, did not move, but watched. Fenwick's hand stilled over his papers. Edward Cavanhill looked at Cecily Marsh standing at the edge of the hall with her ledger, and his expression, which had been a composed surface across the whole difficult morning, had a quality to it now that was different from composure. It was the quality of a man who has been watching a very specific thing and has arrived at a conclusion that costs him nothing to pay and costs him everything at once. He turned to the room. He said, in the voice that Nell would describe in the kitchen for the next 6 months as the voice of a man who has decided to be done with absences, "This estate is not for sale. I am home." He said it once. He did not repeat it. Price said, with the force of a man accustomed to force, that there were signed documents and legal processes, and the matter was not as simple as a declaration, and Edward looked at him with the expression of a man who has spent 7 years in places that had taught him the difference between arguments that needed to be answered and arguments that had already lost. He said, "Fenwick." Fenwick said immediately, "Yes, my lord." He said, "Convey to Mr. Price the circumstances under which any signed agreement becomes void in the event of the title holder's confirmed living presence. Take as long as is necessary." Price was a practical man, as practical men went. He had arrived at his position in the world through the accurate assessment of situations. He looked at Edward Cavanhill standing on the compass rose of his own hall with the documentation of a living earldom already confirmed by a Queen's solicitor in the library, and he looked at Fenwick, and he made, without visible pleasure, but without visible excess, the calculation that was available to him. He said there would need to be discussions. He said them to his agents, not to the room, and he moved toward the morning room door. Lady Dorothea had not moved. She was still at the library door, and her hands were at her sides in the posture of a woman who has not yet decided what posture to adopt, which was, in Cecily's experience of her, the closest Lady Dorothea came to open uncertainty. She looked at her son across the hall. Something moved in her face that was not what Cecily had expected, which was relief, or anger, or calculation. It was older than any of those. It was the look of a woman recognizing that she had been wrong in a way she would need some time to sit with. She said quietly, "Edward," he said, "we will talk. Not today." She looked at him for another moment. She looked once, briefly and without expression, at Cecily. Then she walked to the morning room with her back very straight. The buyer's agents had begun to quiet. They moved toward the door in the shuffling, purposeless way that men moved when a gathering had dissolved its reason for existing. Fenwick was organizing papers. The hall was emptying the way halls emptied when the occasion they had been arranged for was over. Nell appeared at Cecily's shoulder from the direction of the kitchen, which meant Nell had not gone to the kitchen as instructed. But this was not the moment to address it. Cecily stood in the great hall and did not know what to do with her hands. Edward Cavanhill crossed to her. He stopped a proper distance away, the distance of a man who observed the formalities even now, and he looked at the ledger in her hands, and then at her face, and he said, "How much of this house is left in the account books?" She said, steadying her voice with some effort, "Everything. Every expenditure since the spring of 1815. Every arrangement made on the estate's behalf. Every wage paid and owed." He said, "Did you do that for my mother?" She said, because she had decided some time ago that honesty was the only economy she could afford. "No, my lord. I did not think she would want to know." He was still for a moment. He said, "Who did you do it for?" She looked at him. She said, "For the house." Something in his expression, which had been held at the level of civil inquiry, shifted very slightly. Not a smile. Not anything that could be captured in a word. It was the expression of a man who has heard something that answered a question he did not know he had been asking. He said, "Come inside, Miss Marsh. It is cold near the doors." She did. She came inside, into the heart of the hall, and stood on the compass rose while Fenwick gathered his things, and Nell hovered at a discreet distance, and the October light came through the east windows at the long gold angle that meant the afternoon was getting on, and the painted harvest scenes above them were exactly as they had been. And the house was quiet around them in the particular way of a house that has been waiting. She did not yet understand all of what the morning had made possible. She had 3 years of careful management behind her, and a ledger full of accounts, and a habit of not allowing herself to hope for specific things. She had also been in this hall for every one of the 3 years the Earl of Ashford had been absent, and she had cleaned the ceiling, and she had kept the ledger, and she had been unable to leave even today, when leaving would have been the more dignified choice, and the man standing on the compass rose with his travel coat and his early silver temples, and his expression of someone arriving at the beginning of something, was looking at her in a way that her mother's voice, certain as a physical law, would have recognized. She pressed her hand against the ledger. She looked up at the painted ceiling. She said nothing. She did not leave. If you have stayed with this story through all of it, leave a word in the comments for the ceiling that was cleaned for his return. Cecily kept faith in the smallest possible ways. This is one of them. That night, Edward Cavanhill sat in the library of Thornfield Park with the 12 account books stacked on the table before him. The fire was lit. The candles were the good candles from the upper shelf, and he did not know who had lit them, though he had a reasonable suspicion about the kitchen maid who had kept quiet in the back passage and had not quite managed to be invisible since. He opened the first account book. It was dated the autumn quarter of 1815. The handwriting was small and very precise, each figure justified in a column so careful it looked like argument. March repair to the south garden wall, 14 shillings. Replacement latch for the stable door, 3 shillings 6 pence. Wages for Mrs. Henley. Cook, from estate account. Deficit covered from household supplementary fund. Note that this account was to be repaid when estate account was replenished. He turned the pages slowly. April, May, June. Every sash window assessed for warping, 3 repaired from supplementary fund. September, paint to the conservatory ironwork. October, labor for the apple harvest, 4 men hired from Ashwick Village, wages paid, accounts here. November, cleaning of the Great Hall ceiling plasterwork, contracted to a Mr. Jonas Webb of Ashwick, cost borne by Household Supplementary Fund. Condition prior to work was smoke-stained from fireplace use, and the original colors were no longer visible. He stopped. He read that line again. The handwriting did not waver. It was the handwriting of someone who had made this decision deliberately and recorded it as a matter of record, without sentiment and without expectation. He closed the account book. He opened the second one. He read for 3 hours. At some point, Cecily Marsh came to the library door. He heard the hesitation in the footstep, that specific pause outside a threshold. He said, without looking up, "Come in." She came in. She stood near the door. He said, still reading, "The conservatory ironwork. You painted it yourself." She said. "Nell helped," he said. "The latch for the stable door, 3 shillings 6 pence. The previous one was rusted through. The ceiling." A pause, she said. It seemed wasteful to let it go dark. He turned another page. The fire crackled. Outside the library windows, the October wind had come up, and the trees at the south edge of the park were moving in the dark, and the house was quiet around them, with the warmth of a house that had fires in its grates, and candles on its shelves, and bread in its kitchen, which was the warmth of a house that had been tended. He said, his voice careful, "Miss Marsh." She said, "Yes, my lord." He said, "Cecily." He said it the way a man said a name when he meant the saying of it to carry more than the name contained on its own, and she was quiet, and the fire went on. He set the ledger on the table and looked at her across the library. She was standing near the door in the last of the evening light, and she had not, in all of the day's events, once looked frightened. And she did not look frightened now. She looked like a woman who had arrived, by a long and costly route, at a place she had not let herself name. The light lay across one side of her face and left the other in the warmth of the fire, and she stood very still, as people stood when they were not sure what was permitted. He said, "There is a great deal here to be answered for." She said, "There is." he said. "I intend to answer for it." A pause. He looked at the stack of account books. All of it. The fire moved. The candles held. Outside, the October trees leaned in the wind against the sky, and the compass rose on the great hall floor was empty in the dark, and the painted harvest scenes above it waited for morning, and the old stone walls of Thornfield Park held the warmth of a lit hearth, which was the only warmth they required. Cecily Marsh crossed the library floor and sat down across from him at the table. She put the ledger between them, her hand flat on its cover for a moment, before she released it. He opened the next account book. She drew her chair closer to the light. They began.